All right. We would like to welcome our first group of panelists up at this time. Please join me in welcoming Ash Dalkey, Mark Appel, and Sonia Gasho.
All right, we're going to kick this off. Some of this may, before we start, I'll give a quick warning that Zach didn't. It may seem a little strange, like why is he reading a script? Because we're recording, bless you, because we're recording the show live, so there's all these things I have to say. So from time to time, you are going to be witnessing the actual recording of a radio program, which will air on Friday. And at the end of the show, we'll give you all the times and good stuff like that. To the three of you, before we get started, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. All right, Sean, I'll shut up and you can start. Welcome to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. This week, a look at attempts to regulate water use in Cochise County. It's been roughly 8 months since Cochise County voters opted to create a new layer of water regulations for part of the county. The November vote created an active management area in the Douglas Basin, while a similar measure in the Wilcox Basin did not pass. This week's show is being recorded live from the campus of Cochise College in Douglas, Arizona. Joining us on our first panel are Ash Dalkey, who headed the Political Action Committee that put the two AMAs on the ballot, the Arizona Water Defenders, AZ Water Defenders. Also joining us, Mark Appel, the Environmental Projects Coordinator for Cochise County, and Sonia Gasho, a rancher at El Lazy E Ranch. Three of you, thank you so much for joining us. And to our live audience here at Cochise College, thanks for spending some time with us on a Monday evening. We really, really appreciate it. Behind us, just a little housekeeping, we have some maps of the Douglas AMA, just so everybody knows what we're talking about. We know our folks here at Cochise College are pretty familiar with it, but we also have some folks who are watching this on our live stream who may not be from the area, so we want them to know exactly where we're talking about. So Ash, let's start at the top of this, and we will drill down over time as we get into it. But what were the Arizona Water Defenders hoping to solve by getting the AMA questions, the Douglas one that passed, the Wilcox one that did not pass, on the ballot last year?
Thank you for this question, and I want to start out by saying that the Arizona Water Defenders PAC was made up of individuals across the Sulphur Springs Valley, so Wilcox, Pierce, Sunsites, McNeil, Douglas, into Elfrida, and then also in Bisbee, and we formulated as a PAC because we saw this major decline in our aquifer, and so if we take a look at some of the data from ADWR in the Douglas Basin from 1990 to 2021, we've seen an average decline across the basin of 44.6 feet. And we've heard from many of our neighbors, farmers, ranchers, about their wells going dry. And time again, we heard the same story, and we came together as folks in the community who didn't have any political experience to try to solve this problem. And we had seen in years past some of the attempts locally to create something through the legislature. So in 2014, 2015, there was a group led in the Wilcox Basin to designate some groundwater legislation, and that was not heard. There's an effort in the San Simon Valley, which is slightly outside of where we're talking about, but still in southern Arizona. There have been, in 2020, the rural management areas that were put up. In 2020, the bills were received and had hearings, but no vote. In 2021, the same RMA bill was introduced, but there was no hearing or no vote there. So we formulated, because we saw this spinning wheel of legislators not acting. And so we came together and worked together on weekends, holidays, after our day jobs to try to solve this groundwater decline.
Let me ask you something, and it may be the cynical question before we get to Mark and Sonia. There's been a lot of concern expressed by people in the audience, people we've talked to as we were announcing this show, about the inclusion of Bisbee in the Douglas AMA. We checked with the Arizona Water Company and ADWR, the Arizona Department of Water Resources, and the city's municipal wells are all on the San Pedro outside of the Douglas Basin, so no longer regulated by this. The cynic says, or the skeptic says, well, Bisbee leans more left. We want them for the vote. That's why we drew them in. Is that why Bisbee, even though most of their water comes from outside the basin, is in the AMA?
So the basin boundaries were created by ADWR, and that is geologic. That is where the water falls into the basin. And so part of Bisbee is included in the Douglas groundwater basin. Some of it falls outside of that, but that is something that was designated by ADWR way prior to any initiative process or anything like that. So it's geologic where the water flows.
Okay. Sonia, you're a rancher in Pierce.
Yes, sir.
The Wilcox Basin rejected their version. Let me try that again when I don't smack the thing. Sonia, you're a rancher in Pierce. The Wilcox Basin rejected their AMA. Do you see that rejection as a rejection of water regulations or just a rejection of the AMA plan?
We also formed a PAC, Rural Water Assurance, that is now working on becoming a nonprofit to be a umbrella to coordinate between all of the different parts and pieces and agencies that are working on water conservation, which was happening before this election, just not a lot of speaking to each other. So that's what we're working on, and we did oppose both of the AMA designations because we believe the AMA is the wrong tool. Some regulation may be necessary in the future, but we believe that should be under local control and local groups who bring that to the legislature rather than the other way around. I would also respectfully disagree with Ms. Dalkey. The boundary is not a true watershed boundary. Bisbee Junction and parts of that are included because they went off a township and range rather than the actual true watershed.
Okay, Mark, let me come to you as we move down the table in this beginning of the conversation. You told Arizona Capital Times back in September that 92% of the county's water goes toward agriculture. How do we know that?
Those were figures that were collected by the University of Arizona's Water Research Center. And I couldn't speak to exactly where they acquired the data, but there's a pretty good record, public record on the amount of agricultural pumping in Cochise County.
So when it comes to water conservation in the county, since you're with the county, knowing that cuts pretty much anywhere compared to that 92% are going to be, I hate to say it, but I have to, a drop in the bucket. How do you, I know it was bad, how do you deal with that balance?
About between the 92%
and then all the folks who have homes and businesses and things like that,
well,
because it is only 8% of the water usage.
Right, and that figure is quite a bit higher than the state average, which is around 70-some%. And that's because we do have a high concentration on this side of the county and the eastern side of agricultural production and ranching. And but it differs. The county is somewhat bifurcated between the east side, where we have a high agricultural production, and the west side of the county, where we have other users. Residential use is of a concern in the San Pedro Valley, and also the protection of Fort Huachuca as an economic driver, as the #1 economic driver in the county. So it is we have to have a careful balance between, what economic drivers and people's livelihoods on the line here. But the county has very little jurisdiction over regulating water use. Statute does not allow counties to tell people how much water they can use. What we have, some of the tools that we have at our disposal, though, really are land use kinds of decisions that are associated with high water uses. And it's not, we're no stranger, the county's not a stranger to water conservation policies and land use decisions that, we go back 26 years now, largely focused, granted, on the Sierra Vista subwatershed of the upper San Pedro Basin, because of Fort Huachuca as that economic driver. And until recently, we've really been, focused on the San Pedro and protecting the flows of the San Pedro River. But now, recently, being pulled over into this side of the county and looking at, the ways that, what tools do we have at our disposal for supporting the AMA or supporting agriculture and making sure that we achieve that balance.
When you talk about land use as what the county can regulate, is that land use going forward? Is that land use, we're going to change the way land is used? Is it a mix of both, depending on what the situations are?
The county really is not in a position to retroactively change anybody's land use. And we have very, very little jurisdiction over any agricultural uses by statute. So, but secondary agricultural uses like production and processing are things that the county can regulate. And those kinds of uses generally go through a public hearing process before the Planning and Zoning Commission and Board of Supervisors. So it is really up to the discretion of that commission and the board to decide whether or not that any new future land use would have an impact on existing agricultural use, on existing residential uses, like existing commercial uses with regard to water, but also traffic and densities and pollution and things like that.
Let me take this moment to remind our live audience, if you have questions for our panel, write them down on those cards, hold the cards up, and our wonderful production crew will come and probably run around the back, depending on where you are, and grab them from you, and we'll get them brought up. So this is for any of you who would like to jump in on it. There's a long-time perception in this area that big water users are big out-of-state agribusiness. Zach, our producer, and I did stories in 2016 together that dealt with that perception and found some pretty big out-of-state landowners in ranching and nut farming. So is that perception still earned since we last broadcast some of that in 2016, or has it changed? And is the perception reality?
I think perhaps it's grown since 2016. Riverview, one of the big users in this area, has definitely grown and expanded since 2016 in both the Wilcox and Douglas groundwater basin. And I know that's been a lot of concern for many across the valley. And that is another part of us activating and trying to minimize that.
You bring up Riverview. We did a little bit of research on Riverview before we came out here, and this is all from the Department of Water Resources database. They have 371 well entries in the database. 53 wells have been installed since 2000, and 82 of those are within the old Douglas INA, just to give people a look at Riverview as one of the big owners. So what can be done to control those water users while minimizing impact to longtime family farms, which Cochise County has such a tradition of? Sonia?
Well, I wanted to address that question as well. Riverview, I'm not an employee of Riverview. I am not affiliated with Riverview. However, you should be aware, as Mark said, government jobs and Fort Huachuca are the main economic driver. But agriculture is not far behind. If you factor those out, agriculture is a huge part of our economic drivers in this county if you set aside the government jobs. Riverview is a co-op and not a corporation. And for those who may not be familiar, that means that there's lots of family farmers that agree to work together for volume and marketing purposes. That doesn't mean that they're not one big grower in the sense of who owns it because they're a co-op. But it does mean that they don't necessarily have the same cultural values as, say, Walmart or Amazon. They have bought up several of the farms in the area, but much of those farms were already farming, and many of those farmers, in fact, are still farming their own farms and got a really good price and are going to be able to retire and provide for their families when they do. So Riverview is problematic in the sense of, do we still have individual family farms? But they are also very much contributing to our community.
Let's touch on something that we, again, have heard from people in the audience. When it comes to those family farms, especially versus the big out-of-state agribusinesses that are coming in. Right now, ADWR has a cost of somewhere between $500 and $10,000 to grandfather in current wells. They told us they're going to try and get it to $75, but it hasn't happened yet. And we invited them to come and be on the panel, and they politely declined. So we can only go with really what's on their website. How much do those fees, as a smaller farmer, not a big corporate farmer, when you see those, how much does it, for you and your neighbors, say, maybe it's time to sell out, maybe it's time to grow houses, maybe it's time to do something else?
Well, I think that certainly for some people that plays into it, but most of the ranchers and farmers that I know have no intentions of selling. They want to pass it on to their children and be good stewards of the land. I would also say that ADWR did not inform anyone, either the water defenders or rural water assurance, that they were going to be charging those fees before the vote took place. I think that would have changed some folks' minds.
Ash, you wanted to jump in on that.
Absolutely. I mean, that was announced at one of their public meetings I believe it was in the January meeting, and that was something that was pretty outrageous. But one of the things, and I double-checked with ADWR this morning, on June 26th, there was an expedited rulemaking meeting about lowering those fees. From this morning, what they said via email is they are still in the process of finalizing this submission, and we'll see it on their website when it, in fact, goes through. But a lot of that was folks advocating, both in the Douglas AMA and the new Wallapai INA, saying that these fees are outrageous. The fee was something in rule and not in statute, so it was something that could be changed. And from January until today, we've seen folks activate to say, hey, that's not okay.
There is, turned in on Friday, a couple days before this show, 2,000, I think it was 2,100 or so petitions to put the Douglas AMA back on the November ballot in the hopes of the petition gatherers, pull it back. We're still waiting on the county to verify the signatures, so as of the taping of this show, by the time it airs, we might know the answer, but right now, tonight, we don't know that it will definitely be on the ballot or not. Does this issue, Ash, do you think, help potentially if it gets on ballot? Just pull it back, people feeling like, and any of you can jump in on this, feeling like they were lied to, I guess in this case, by the state, or at least information was omitted by the state. We won't say they were lying necessarily.
Well, and I think, with this issue coming up, the AMA was always seen, at least by myself, as a form of triage. So it was not the only solution to this issue, right? The groundwater decline is major. It was to help pause things where they were at. So local efforts by local folks could happen. And we could see potentially less decline in the groundwater. And so although there are these efforts, I obviously wouldn't want to see the AMA taken back. There is with bureaucratic systems, kind of a long timeline. And so any sort of management plan, which is the policies, wouldn't be implemented until 2027. And so that's a long time from now, and that's a lot of decline in between now and then. But and that gives time for other folks to make things happen. There is something that we do get right off the bat, which is the freeze on the cultivation of new irrigated acres. So that's the freeze that I'm talking about. That kind of keeps things in place so we can figure out other ways to attack this problem, because there isn't just one solution to this issue in Cochise County.
When you talk about, yes, go ahead.
If I could tag team off of that, I think that yes, that is a big part of the effort to repeal it, is that folks feel like they were not completely informed of all of the ramifications of the AMA. I also think it, again, highlights that we want local control and to choose solutions. There are many solutions. In fact, Mark and I have had conversations about recharge. There are many other solutions that can be implemented, and to me that just highlights that, again, the AMA is not, and it hopefully was not, the correct tool for the aquifer situation.
Let me slide my computer over here so I can take some of the audience questions as we move forward here. A question for you, Mark. In 2022, then Governor Doug Ducey signed legislation to provide $1.2 billion to boost long-term water supplies and water conservation efforts across the state. How much was allocated to Cochise County, and specifically the Sulphur Springs Valley, and what projects will we see from the county in the future?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of our focus has been over in the San Pedro Valley, so we have some really good precedents over there on the types of projects that might be implemented here in the Sulphur Springs Valley. They didn't allocate that money, by county or by areas of the county. They're making that money available through WIFA, the Water Infrastructure Financing Authority. And in the San Pedro Valley, our Cochise Conservation and Recharge Network just recently applied for a substantial chunk of funding to help bridge some of our recharge projects that have been on the books now since around 2014 or 2015. And as Sonia mentioned, we may be able to, especially with the advent of a new nonprofit organization, that's something that's been sorely lacking on this side of the county, are those partnerships. And we have a really great reputation and precedent for that over in the San Pedro Valley, as you know, Chris, from previous shows. And we're hoping that that same kind of synergy can happen on this side of the county. And then that would put them in a position to apply for some of that funding from WIFA.
Moving again through some of these questions, how can an AMA address what the questioner is referring to as the invasive industrial agriculture operations and protect local farms? And then kind of a sub-question to you specifically, Sonia, of course, any of you can jump in on this. How would you propose the over-extraction of groundwater by corporate farms be stopped to protect small farms? So really the same question, but do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, we've been discussing different solutions. As I said earlier, there may be some type of regulation necessary, but it needs to be locally developed and presented rather than from the top down, as it were, from the state of Arizona. Some of those things would be potentially an irrigation district in the Wilcox Basin. The Douglas Basin has the irrigation non-expansion area if the AMA is repealed. Another thing would be major recharge projects. Mark and the Fort Huachuca already have the Sentinel Landscape project going. The Wilcox Playa is now considered part of that, so that would be another project. And then also farmers and ranchers coming together and developing, again, their own versions of that and working together to find those solutions that will, with all of our neighbors and friends, reduce water use, conserve where we can, without doing away with the farms.
Ash, do you have any thoughts on that? How to prevent the corporate farms from taking over because they have the money potentially for the grandfathering if the rule gets held up?
Sure, and so I think there's a lot of powerful things with the AMA that you do not get with the INA. One of those things being the Groundwater Users Advisory Council, which the governor appoints, and anybody who hopefully resides in the basin can apply for that. And so any policies that come to fruition, the Groundwater Users Advisory Council helps navigate that conversation and any of the policy that would move forward, and that could include some of those larger water users in the basin.
Sonia, you mentioned, and I'm going to follow up on something both of you just said before we get back to audience questions, local control. Mm-hmm. Ash, you said that the governor appoints the council, but they don't have to be from this area. So how do the folks here ensure that their voices are heard and it's not somebody from Imperial Maricopa County?
Go ahead.
Okay, I mean, we don't want that, right? We want local people, and a part of applying to be on the groundwater, we keep calling it the GUAC, so excuse me for saying that and not saying it out, but people, when they apply for the GUAC, they have folks.
And what is the GUAC?
Groundwater Users Advisory Council.
Okay.
So they have letters of recommendation written that the governor and the governor's office takes a look at. From what I've heard is, you know, if somebody with outside of the basin boundaries, it would be very slim chance for them to be on that council, because the point is to have local folks have their neighbors, local ranchers, local farmers, a part of this conversation. So that's the hope. I mean, through some of the things that we've seen through rulemaking, if we see, you know, who is appointed, I think there's always public feedback to the governor's office saying, hey, why is this person who, you know, lives in Maricopa County on this? I think there is a lot that we've seen folks activating around groundwater in Cochise County, and so I would see that continuing if we had somebody on that advisory council who wasn't local.
So you're correct that it can be anyone who's appointed by the governor. Yes, you have a application process and letters of recommendation, and anyone who's willing to serve on that right now, please go apply. However, there is no set representation, as in you have 5 members, they could all be from Sierra Vista, they could all be from Douglas, they could all be ranchers, none of them be farmers and ranchers. So that's problematic. Also, as a former government employee who wrote conservation plans and deals with these things, I do not harbor any illusions that a advisory council has any regulatory authority. Yes, they can come up with a draft management plan, but Pinal County in their existing AMA has already seen, as they're on their 5th management plan, that ADWR does not have to listen to the GUAC, and they do not have to take those into consideration. And as we know, water is such a hot political issue that it's likely to be hijacked by other concerns.
So what is, and this plays perfectly into one of the audience questions, what's the recourse if the council and the state do something with the AMA that the people who live in the AMA or in the surrounding parts of Cochise County don't like and don't think is the right answer? Is there any recourse, or
there is,
too bad?
but it's judicial review. And as you can imagine,
and that's expensive.
It's expensive and long, and anytime you go to court, you never know what the end result is going to be. So again, local folks coming together through the natural resource conservation districts, the county, all of those kind of groups, in the long run is going to be much more effective and pertinent to the area than even a GUAC would be.
And if I could, I think that one particular tool or part of the process for adopting the management plan, as they are doing right now with the goal, are these public hearings. So making sure people showing up at these public hearings and getting the press involved with the turnouts and the comments and the feedback is going to be an important component of ADWR hearing whether or not people like, the policies that they're coming up with or that the GUAC is coming up with.
Mark, does the county have any role in this, or do you all just have to sit back, this is a state issue, and that's it?
Well, the county's growth and development is really guided by its comprehensive plan. And, we're coming up on 10 years where the county's going to have to readopt its comprehensive plan. And it's already chock full of water policies and water conservation policies and natural resource conservation policies. But I think the readoption or amending of the new comprehensive plan in the next couple years should somewhat synchronize with what the management planning process looks like for the AMA here. And I think it won't be that big of a lift for the county to do that, because we've already, as I said, there's a precedent for that on one side of our county, and there's no reason why that synergy couldn't be created over here in terms of water policies, zoning regulations, things like that. I'm not suggesting that we have more zoning regulations. We have plenty of those in place. Many of those were adopted for the Sierra Vista area and the kinds of growth that were going on over there that people were concerned about. And that just highlights that there are other things happening in this county besides agriculture. Agriculture is an important part of our county's culture and economic base, but we also have the city of Douglas and a new port of entry coming in that could really spur on new development in warehousing and other land uses near the border here. So new residential development, new commercial development could really be on the radar for the AMA. So it's not just agriculture. The AMA shouldn't just address agriculture, but it's going to have to address the whole spectrum of land uses that are potentially coming down the pike here.
We're going to get into some of that on our second panel, and as we wind this one up for time reasons, one of the things in the AMA is metering of wells. The question here, can you describe how that works and what kind of authority does the state or whoever the enforcing authority is have to make sure that compliance is maintained? Okay, I dig my well and I just open it up and maybe I get a nasty letter, but if I'm not a good citizen, worried about the rest of my neighbors, what's the compliance enforcement on this? If we know at this point.
We do not really know at this point. We know that folks pumping over 35 gallons per minute or are irrigating more than 2 acres of produce for human consumption or animal consumption will have to meter their wells. In terms of enforcement, that's something, there's a kind of love-hate relationship with ADWR. There's lots of questions that we asked along the way that weren't always answered. And so I don't have the specifics of how ADWR would kind of function in that way. I don't know if anybody else has any answers to that. If so, I'd love to hear them too. But
no, we've heard a lot about determining a farm yield and your water duties and how meters would be installed. I know that you have to report, and the question was, do you report like you do now with the INA with just a copy of your utility bill, or will they actually be satellite linked? We don't know. And as far as compliance, that's going to depend on how often it's enforced.
From what I do know, I believe the process will be very similar to the INA, so reporting. So folks who are already participating in that, if they're within the boundaries of the INA, then they will go through a similar process that they're already doing.
This is actually a question as we wrap this panel up that our producer, Zach, and I were talking about as we were coming down. And a former Cochise County supervisor told him years ago when he was working on a water story down here that it really doesn't matter how much water the people of the Douglas Basin can serve, because in Agua Prieta, if they're still using toilets that use 4 or 5 gallons per flush, the basin does not recognize the international border. It goes right on into Mexico, and that then affects the Douglas AMA. So are there any efforts, or the Douglas Basin, whether the AMA survives a vote or not, are there any efforts to work with basin users south of the border since they're all tied?
And so
Ash.
one point there is our groundwater basin actually flows into Agua Prieta. And so anything that we do here will definitely benefit, but the way that the water flows is southward. And so them flushing their toilets, it's not affecting the water here because it's flowing south.
It's flowing south, so
Correct.
Douglas, Bisbee, and the rest of the Douglas Basin get the water first, if you will, on recharge.
Correct. And that would, USGS estimates that right now the inflow to the Douglas groundwater basin is 22,000 acre feet per year. But the outflow is 45,000 acre feet per year. And so that's a major difference, and any sort of collaboration with Mexico should definitely happen. As we've seen too, historically with the smelter in Douglas and some of that was folks both in Douglas and in Agua Prieta, political leaders kind of working together to make that happen. And so I would see there needs to be some organization there too, as we move forward.
Okay, for time reasons, we have to wrap this up, this first panel. So Mark Appel, Ash Dalkey, and Sonia Gasho, thank you for spending some time with us. Thank you to the audience for your first round of questions. And this is for our radio audience. You're listening to The Buzz. After the break, we hear about the direct impacts of water on two major industries in Cochise County, so stay with us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zach for a minute.
There we go. Thank you all for joining us so far. A quick break. You can hear this music. It's going to be up for a minute, then we'll have something else. When you hear this again, that's your cue to get back into the room, please. So join us, and thank you for your good questions, your attention, and we will be seeing you shortly. All right, everybody. In just a minute, we're going to get back going here. Thank you again for turning out. If you need a resupply of note cards, feel free to grab some. But please do get heading to your seat as soon as you get a moment. All right, everyone, please return to your seats. We are getting ready to start. I'll give you a few seconds to quiet down. All right, thank you. Thank you very much. You folks are a great audience. This is awesome.
He does that to me all the time in the studio, too.
Yeah, I do it all the time. That's what I'm saying. If you see me talking in the headset to him, is exactly that. Yeah. All right, so I would like to introduce you to our second panel. You'll get more of an introduction shortly, but please welcome to our stage Daniel Coxworth, Dr. Edie Gustafson, and Jackie Watkins. Thank you all for joining us. Here we go with the second half of our show. Thank you very much and enjoy.
Welcome back to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. We're recording this episode live at the Cochise. Let's try that again. See, this is the magic of taping. Welcome back to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. We're recording this episode live from the Cochise College campus in Douglas, Arizona, as we talk about water regulation here in Cochise County. In the first half of the show, we talked about the effort to bring more water regulation to portions of Cochise County and what it will look like from the governmental side. Now we focus on how things will change for those who use the water to make a living. Joining us for our second panel are two people from the agricultural industry, one whose farm is in the new Douglas Active Management area and one whose vineyard is in the failed Wilcox AMA. Dr. Edie Gustafson co-owns High Lonesome Vineyards in McNeil. Jackie Watkins co-owns and operates San Ysidro Farm, also in McNeil, Arizona. Our third panel member joins us to talk about another industry that's important to the area, home building. Daniel Coxworth is the Director of Development Services for Cochise County. Thank you to the three of you for joining us. So let's start as we did a little bit higher up, if you will, with the first panel. And Edie, I'm going to start with you. Your crop, grapes, are notoriously water sippers by comparison to other agricultural products. We had a winemaker in Wilcox tell us for an episode back in the fall that he really doesn't use much more water than what falls on his land in terms of rainfall. So how has the AMA changed your farming habits?
Well, just a quick correction, Chris. Our vineyard is inside of the Douglas AMA, not in the failed Wilcox AMA.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. We are a very low water usage crop. Out of the 20 different types of crops grown in the state of Arizona, one being the highest water usage and 20 being the low water usage, grapes are number 18. We only use anywhere from a half an acre foot to a 1.5 acres of water a year, which is actually less water than a 3-bedroom family home uses in a year. And we only water 6 months out of the year. Our drip irrigation is the most effective and efficient form of irrigation that you can get when you're doing irrigation, because it goes right where you want it to go. It's not like the big pivots where they can have them 2, 3, 4 feet high. It's nothing like that. It's right where you want it to go each and every time. So the amount of water that we use is nothing compared to what you see with the big pivots, with the grain crops, nothing like that at all.
So how has the AMA changed what you all are doing at High Lonesome?
Well, we, under the we fell under the irrigation on expansion area. And back in 2016, we actually wrote the Arizona Department of Water Resources and asked a very important question. We, by county standard, can divide our 36 acres down into 4-acre increments. And we could put an exempt well on each one of those, 4-acre lots if we had wanted to. And we can irrigate 1.99 acres with each one of those domestic wells, or exempt wells, which is kind of interesting. So when we wrote them, and the specific person that we wrote, by the way, happens to be the person in charge of the Douglas AMA, Miss Natalie Mast, when she was a water resource specialist. We didn't get a response back. So we subdivided into 3s and put in our second well on a different lot, as the statute required us to do. We started to develop that next lot. Hundreds of thousands of dollars later, 6 years go by, the AMA comes up. The water department says, we want to come inspect. We think we're doing the right thing. We allow them on our property to inspect. They stand there, they do all their measurements. Matter of fact, they took my measurements that I had already measured out as the truth, and they were, I'm not gonna lie, stood there and told my husband and I to our face, you're good, and left. 1 week, 30 days later, and 1 week away from drilling our 3rd exempt well, we got a notice in the mail. We're in violation. We need to cease and desist, rip out 1.3 acres of vines, or face a $10,000 a day fine. And that's by the Arizona water statute. That is how this whole thing has affected us, not just because we were under the ANA, but now if we have a wildfire out by us, because some of the cattle people out there can't fill their dirt tanks with water because they can no longer use those wells, the wildfire is just gonna burn like crazy because the wildfires no longer have a dipping station to go to get the water to fight the wildfires. So that is how this has affected my vineyard, just my vineyard alone, not to mention how it's going to affect the entire wine industry across the entire state. 80% of the wine grapes in Arizona are grown right here in Cochise County, right here. There's a lot more it's gonna affect.
Jackie, let me jump to you. You all on San Ysidro Farms, you have alfalfa, which is a thirsty crop, but you also have livestock and a number of other things. How has the AMA changed what you all are doing?
So far, it hasn't changed anything. We have pecan trees. We grow hay for the dairy industry and the horses industry for livestock, and then we also do beef and lamb. But the rules haven't been implemented yet. You know, there's not the goal. That's not been set. So the AMA hasn't changed us.
Do you have concerns? Every farmer I've ever talked to over decades of this career is always looking ahead, what's next, because farming's hard work. Do you have concerns that once the rules come in, you all could be in trouble, or fingers crossed everything's going to work out okay for you?
We expect that the water that we'll be able to irrigate, the acre feet per acre, will decrease over time, because the fact is the water level, the groundwater level is depleting. I'd like to think that my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren will still be able to farm, but we can't farm today in 20 years we can't still be farming like we are today. We have to use less water. And there was a group of us farmers that got together when the AMA was started in January to send comments in about the anticipated goal at that time. So we do know that we're going to have to decrease acre feet. It's just how much acre feet can we afford to do with the crops we're currently growing. There's a lot of people that want us to grow different crops that use less water. Most farmers would do that if we can, if it's economically viable. To be sustainable, you first have to be economically viable. And to grow those crops, can we grow them, and is there a market that we can send those crops to? There is a market for what we're growing today.
Dan, let me turn to you for a minute. We'll come out of agriculture for a second. Your office has a pulse on new home building in the county. Have things changed, as we heard in the first panel about subsidence? Water has become more scarce, and do we know what will happen when it comes not only to home building, but just general expansion potentially as the AMA goes further into effect, assuming it doesn't go on the ballot and get pulled back?
For the most part, residential development in the county has been fairly steady. We primarily see development on our larger lot parcels of land, particularly in the Douglas area. I've been with the county in this position 5 years, and we have not processed one subdivision plat, which is typically where you see the density. Many more lots are being platted, they're connected to a water system. So the development we see is more scattered, wildcat splitting based on state law. You can split up your parcel up to 5 times, and that's primarily what you see, and that growth pattern is what you see south of Sierra Vista, which is where most of the residential development is occurring in the county. Our expectation is as the growth corridor from Tucson and Vail will reach the Benson area. That's where we see where residential development will pick up. We do assist the city of Benson with their plan review, and it's fairly steady up there as well. They have a lot of platted subdivisions up there already, lots just sitting there waiting to be developed, and they're being bought by national home builders. So for the most part, steady. Probably has slowed down a little bit. We thought it would slow down a lot more with climbing interest rates, but the availability of water has yet really to affect any type of residential development that we're seeing, although we do hear some pretty bad stories up in the Wilcox area of residential wells going dry.
And Wilcox and Benson are not part of the Douglas Basin, so for the purposes of this discussion, the Douglas AMA will not affect, whatever happens with the Douglas AMA will not affect it. A few questions for all of you, but I want to start with a clip from a recent speech by State Attorney General Chris Mays talking about the AMA. And Sean, for you, just in the back, this is clip 2.
The very fact that the voters here took matters into their own hands to create an AMA is a sign of the failure of the state to help local communities manage their groundwater supplies.
So when you hear the Attorney General say that, what do the three of you think about that comment as she was talking about the AMA? Edie?
I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what goes on down here from the folks up in Phoenix. Farmers and ranchers are some of the best stewards of water conservation, the local farmers and ranchers. Big agribusiness, I get what the Arizona Water Defenders was trying to do, but calling the AMA a triage, in the military, when I was in the military, I retired after 20 years, we have a saying, you don't put a Band-Aid on a sucking chest wound. And that's kind of what this AMA has done. There are second, third, and fourth order of consequences for it. And the people in Phoenix just don't understand what we do down here. Our county is primarily agriculture, and that is how we have survived in this county. And nowhere in the proposed management goal is agriculture even mentioned. They want to attempt to try to maintain. Well, what's in the word attempt? And they have the word communities in there. What communities are we talking about? Are we talking about just the cities, the urban areas, or the rural areas, the agricultural areas? They aren't, it's not all inclusive. And we can use the GUAC and try to get things included and all that kind of fun stuff. But, like Sonia Gasho pointed out, it may not be people from here. It might be people in Sierra Vista or people from Phoenix or wherever. There are certain qualifications that the governor is going to look at to see that you have to be in that GUAC. So, I heard the Attorney General say that if the Water Department thought it was so important for us to become an AMA, why didn't they step in and do that a long time ago?
Do either of you want to jump in on that, Jackie, Dan?
Well, it wasn't the Water Department. ADWR didn't decide. It was the voters of the basin that decided. But ranchers and farmers, we don't want to use any more water than we need. It costs us. Our pumping cost per pivot is, $3,000 to $5,000 a month. That's not a cheap cost. And so we are using more efficient water today in irrigation than we were when the INA started. And there's less irrigated acres out there today being irrigated than there was in 1980 when the INA started. So we don't want, everyone wants to use less water, but it's hard to, we still have to be doing our share for the citizens of the county to produce agriculture. If you don't have agriculture, you don't have a society.
Let me ask you, and Edie, you can jump in on this too if you want. We heard in the first panel, and we've heard about it for years, that perception that there are big multinational, international companies here in Cochise County farming big deep pockets for big deep wells. From your experiences, is that true, or is it still a lot of the agriculture is, like you all, family owned, no matter what it is you're ranching or growing?
If you're irrigating, it doesn't matter if you're big or small, you're still irrigating. And being that it was the Douglas INA, the people who are not in the area that are pumping, they bought the property that was already being irrigated. So for me, if it's irrigated by a family farm or it's irrigated by someone from California that is depleting their water, that's, they got out of almonds over there and they're doing pecans over here. I'm not sure how many are actually corporations, as in a Walmart type corporation, but most of those are also family farms. We have 3,000 or 4,000 acre family farms that are started here, that their families been here for centuries,
for generations, yeah.
And they're large, but you need a large amount of property to actually make a good living if you're not doing just vegetables.
Right, especially if you've got cattle or something like that.
Yeah, they're large properties.
Right.
And I agree with Jackie. Irrigation is irrigation, no matter how you want to look at it. However, to answer your question, with the big out-of-state or international agribusiness that has come in, there are reasons that they have come in, and some of the reasons they have stated is because our lack of water regulation. But the Attorney General has pulled a lot of the Saudi Arabian alfalfa farms is what we're talking about, up in near Yuma. They pulled any of their new applications for them to put in new wells. So there are ways to stop big agribusinesses from doing that, especially international ones. But the AMA is not the way to do it, because it didn't stop, let's face it, it didn't stop Riverview, okay? Riverview has the wells, they have the land, they have what they need. The people that it hurt are the local, the small moms and pops. That's who it has hurt. It didn't stop Riverview. It stopped some of the bigger ranchers who now have water or wells they can no longer use. It stopped people like my husband and I. The water department is basically shutting us down. Over the next 10 years, they will have cost us $3 million in sales alone because of the vines we ripped out. So it's not just looking at the big agribusiness. This county survives off of agriculture, primarily. Yeah, we have tourism that comes to Bisbee, they come to Tombstone, they go to Wilcox, and they go down to Douglas, they come across the border. That's all great. They do that, and we need that. But this county traditionally survives off of agriculture.
Let me remind everybody here in our audience, if you have questions, I see our crew members walking around picking some up, but go ahead and hold them up because we're about to get to that portion of this. Dan, let's jump back for a second to home building. We've heard a lot lately in the news about the 100-year water supply rule, especially up in Phoenix. Obviously, as you said, not the big developments down here that we're seeing on the outskirts of Phoenix. But do county offices have to deal with that here, or does that information come from above? How do you deal with the 100-year, especially up in Benson? Again, out of the AMA, but it's all part of the county.
Sure, regardless of where you're located, if you're subdividing property through a subdivision plat, which we haven't seen in a long time, they are required to obtain a certificate of 100-year groundwater supply through ADWR. To get that right, Jackie? And so we haven't had to deal with it very much here because we just aren't seeing those large growth developments yet. Maybe when those lots are built out, or maybe, as Mark was alluding to, the new commercial port of entry, if that triggers the need or the market for larger subdivision developments in the county around the city of Douglas, we may then see the impact of that type of development here and whether our housing supply can keep up with the economic growth that we have here in the county.
We've heard that expansion of the port here in Douglas could be a problem with the AMA if it stays in place. I guess this is going to be one of those time will tell.
We'll see how the plan works its way out, what the goals of the plan. The type of development you see on the U.S. side for a new commercial port of entry is very low water usage. You'll see warehousing. You may see some light assembly on this side of the border. Probably some parking lots for trucks and storage of materials. So I don't expect this to really negatively impact the development that we anticipate to see with that new commercial port of entry.
Jackie or Edie, we talked about in the first panel some of the things that after voters approved the AMA were learned about, a bit of a surprise, if you will, the cost for grandfathering wells, some things like that. In addition to that, were there things that came out after the vote was done that surprised you all about the AMA at all?
I read the statutes in the administrative code, so I knew that there was fees. It's government, there's always fees. So I wasn't surprised because it was in the statutes and in the administrative code.
Edie, anything?
I think what surprised everybody was, when it came to the fees, was the people who are already in the INA were already had irrigation grandfathered rights. And what they didn't understand was, why do they have to reapply to keep a grandfathered right they already had? And the paperwork, depending upon how they filed, was $500 to $1,000, depending upon which file they were going to file. And then there was going to be, they have till March of 2024 to file for their grandfathered rights. Then there's a 6-month protest period where ADWR will post all of those applications online, where anybody within the AMA, can actually protest those applications, but you can only protest what is on the application. You can't protest it because you don't like the person. And then, so that puts us in September of 2024. And then there's another period where ADWR takes time to review the protests and then review the paperwork. So that it put it all the way out to like September of 2025 before they're going to decide who gets their irrigation grandfathered rights and who doesn't. And oh yeah, until they come up with this new fee that they're going to charge everybody, it's supposed to be a flat fee, they're going to charge you $118 an hour to review the paperwork. That's what got everybody upset, because that can go as high as $10,000. That's what everybody was upset about. That was never told to everybody. Before the AMA was voted in and we had meetings with the Arizona Department of Water Resources, we asked, what will the AMA look like if it's voted in? And we were told, well, we don't know because you have to vote it in. So we were all like, really? And now that we know what it looks like, a lot of people are like, yeah.
And that's
Jackie,
why,
yeah.
that's why a group of us worked with the legislatures to make it just a flat fee. Because yes, there was an application fee when the INA came in 1980, so we already have the irrigation rights to pay additional money besides the nominal fee. You know, we already have the rights, we're just perfecting the rights under the AMA. And so I feel confident that the legislature is going to pass the flat fee rate instead of the hourly rate.
Let me get to your questions, you, the audience, who are here. And there's one that popped up, actually, I can answer just from having covered water, and it's a definition question, and it's what's the difference between surface and groundwater? And many of you here may know that because you've dealt with it, but maybe our listeners don't. The easiest way to describe it is surface water is water on the surface. It's rivers like the San Pedro, just a little ways away, and groundwater is water in the ground. That's the easiest way to explain it for those who are wondering as we throw these terms around.
And also, the surface water watershed is not the same boundary of the groundwater. Like the groundwater basin here, Douglas was designated a critical watershed or critical groundwater in 1965. And that boundary was made in 1965, and at that time people had the opportunity to say if they approved it or not. I don't know what happened back then, but the watershed, because the watershed is larger than the AMA boundaries.
So we've talked a little bit about tonight, we've mentioned a couple of times wells going dry. We've heard about that in many areas of Cochise County. Is there any documentation that, maybe Dan, you know about it, on how many have gone dry over the last couple of years, 20 years, 30 years, however far back documentation might go? Does anybody know?
I don't know. You know, it was mentioned the county really does not have much authority or regulations in place to regulate water, except for when it comes to development and the type of development that we see in the county. But no, I don't know, Jackie.
ADWR would know, because to deepen your well, if you have an existing well and you have to dig it deeper, you have to get a permit to do that.
And we know from research that we've done, their database, they being the state ADWR, it has 250,000 wells listed in the state of Arizona, not just in Cochise County. So it's a big number. We would have to look, as you said, go back and play with it.
And if I can carry on that too, Chris, you got to understand too that some of the wells that are in were put in the 30s, and the 40s, and the 50s. And they went 100, 150 feet. The technology today is totally different than it was back then. So wells have to be maintained. Pumps have to be maintained. If you don't maintain your wells, they get clogged. They're going to get silt and stuff in them. So some of that is the problem. There have been cases, and of where people have had their wells go dry, so to speak, or going dry, and people down the road have cleaned up and maintained their pumps, and all of a sudden, all the water's back. So, and ADWR has been challenged time and time again and asked in the meetings, where are you getting your data where all these wells, where the water is dropping? And they say, oh, well, here and there and there and there. And people stand up and say, not my well. My well, the water went up 2 feet. What are you talking about? Where's it going down? So the stuff, ADWR does not post on there whose wells have gone dry. They've been asked in the meetings. Where? Show us. We'd like to see it. But they don't have it.
Let me ask
But you,
something.
you
Go ahead, Jackie, yes.
You can go online and you can click on every well that's in the AMA, and it will show you what the water level is. I mean, our irrigation, we have dropped a foot a year for the last 20 years.
So let me ask the two of you, because you've talked about wells and things like that, and for those of us who are not in agriculture or who are not on wells or on municipal water, we don't know much about digging wells. What does it cost, ballpark, to dig a well? So our listeners, again, who are on a municipal system and don't know, they understand what you all in agriculture are talking about.
Homeowner's well or exempt well is $30,000 to $50,000. Typically, if you're going 300 to 400 feet, an irrigation well is $250,000 up.
So not a cheap endeavor by any means.
Correct, not at all. And with the price of steel having gone up, we've seen it go from $20, $25 a foot for the steel casing to $55, $60 a foot for the steel casing. Our third well that we were going to put in was going to be at 600 feet. That just happens to be the depth that we were going to have to go. Growing up, I was always taught you never stop at the first aquifer. You always punch down through to at least the second one, because the first one will be the first one. If it goes dry, to go dry, go to the second one. It was going to be at over 600 feet. So 600 feet times $55 a foot is astronomical. So what we don't understand as for us is why people on municipal water all of a sudden, and I know it's a part of the statute, but all of a sudden got a say over my $35,000 well that I got to put in, that I paid for.
Coming back to a question, someone has brought it back up from the first panel. So what happens if we don't like what ADWR does regarding the AMA? What steps can be taken if their goals are unsatisfactory? Maybe we don't know the answer.
Well, Sonia and Ms. Delke hit it on the nail on the head. There is the GUAC. We do have the Users Advisory Council to the governor. However, there's no guarantee that our opinions are going to be listened to, or that the GUAC's information, when it's given to the governor, or even to the water department, is going to be listened to at all. At one of the meetings, the water department passed out all these comments that they had been receiving. 70% said this, and 30% said that, and 35% said this. And when I challenged them on it, who said this? Because I guarantee you 75% of the people didn't say exactly this. And their answer was, oh, well, we kind of lumped them all together and surmised the comments. Well, is that what's going to happen with the GUAC?
One difference with the Douglas AMA and the other AMAs is that we don't, Phoenix and Tucson, they're continuing to grow, but they have CAP and SRP water. We don't have an outside water source for this basin.
Well, and that's a good point. When we hear so much about water issues in Arizona, they're always talking about the Colorado River. That doesn't come over here. That water is Phoenix and Tucson, as you said. So this is a completely similar issue, but a different issue because it's not the Colorado, which people may not realize. So, question from the audience, if local control is a desirable option, why are wells going dry or having to be deepened when people have been in control until this point? Don't they need some guidance, shall we say, from be it an AMA or something else?
The one person that I've ever heard in government, the 9 best words I've ever heard come out of a government official's mouth came from Ronald Reagan. And he said, "Beware of, I am from the government and I am here to help you."
I somehow knew you were going to say that. So, again, a question from the audience. Is it true with an AMA you can run pipes from one well to another to provide water to other pastures? And maybe this hasn't been decided yet since the rules for this AMA are still being worked on, it sounds like.
You can link your irrigation wells together.
Okay.
And from what I know, that you'll still be able to water your livestock in different pastures.
But not the tanks as are done now, correct?
No, you'd have a water tank at the end of the pipe to water the cows.
Okay. Question here. Do we know much about the quantity of goods raised by big farms versus small farms? I guess, you know, the majority of the farms in the Douglas Basin and maybe the county, are they these big farms? And I think by big, the person means the big corporate farms as opposed to acreage. As you pointed out, Jackie, if you're running cattle, you can have a lot of acreage but still be a family farm. Do we know whether, you know, the quantity of goods percentages from big versus small?
Most of the farmers, even some people might call them big, they'll have 1,000, 2,000 acres. Those are not big farms, those are medium-sized farms. And those people are usually doing commodity crops, corn, beans, potatoes. There's a lot of potatoes being grown in the valley, but those are not the smaller farm that is selling vegetables to farmers markets, CSA, school programs. But most of the farmers are forage for animals, alfalfa, oats, triticale, or corn, beans, cotton.
Go ahead, Jack.
I'm Edie.
Or Edie, sorry.
okay.
You know, we've only been up here for 35 minutes. You think
okay.
I would have figured that out.
Well, I just have a few facts for you on that. Economic contributions made through wine grape growing, winemaking, and wine sales, investments in vineyards and wineries, and associated multiplying effects. The total contribution is $159.6 million in sales in the state of Arizona and $78.3 million in gross state product. This does not count in sales tax advantages. Let me say that again. This does not count in the sales tax advantage to the state. In addition, wine grapes supported nearly 1,200 jobs in 2019 before COVID, when including multiplier effects of ancillary business supported because of the wine industry, with 80% of those grapes being grown right here in Cochise County.
We have time for one more question, and it's a broad one. Any of you can jump in on this. Again, comes from our audience. Can you speak to the ethics of water conservation? When is the greater good more than the individual, in this case, the individual probably farm?
You have to have a balance, and we need to have agriculture in the county because we're importing water. Every time food that's brought from some other country, water is an issue worldwide. And if you're importing water from your food, we need to not be elitists that think, okay, well, we won't do any agriculture here, we'll just import and dry up some other place. So there has to be a balance. We don't know what that balance is, but we still will be depleting the aquifer to a certain amount. We are in a 20-year drought, and it's the highest drought in the last 1,200 years from tree rings. So we are in a drought. So some of the combining issues is we're in a drought, so we're not getting the recharge. But once the drought is over, then the aquifer should come up.
Okay. I'm going to wrap this up. Again, they give me all these long words to read. So that was Daniel Coxworth, Edie Gustafson, and Jackie Watts. No, see, again, read the words that are in front of you, and it works so much better. That was Daniel Coxworth, Edie Gustafson, and Jackie Watkins. And that's the buzz for this week. You can find all our episodes online at azpm.org and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcast. Just search for The Buzz Arizona. We're also on the NPR app. Thanks to our audience tonight for attending our live recording and to the staff of Cochise College for their help. Zach Ziegler is our producer with production help this week from Summer Hom and Desiree Tucker. The AZPM live event staff for this show includes Sean Teague, Timna Gershon, Greg Gutierrez, Bob Lindberg, Nate Huffman, Dara Sam, Sam Cantor, Aiden Wohl, Ahmad Lomax, and Gary Bell. Thank you to all of you all for getting this put on live for us. Our music is by Enter the Haggis. I'm Christopher Conover. Thanks for listening. And now here's Zach again.
Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you to you all. Please give yourself a round of applause because you are a wonderful audience. I'm going to steal a line from my host. It is often invoked these days to belittle and attack the other side, those you don't agree with. You showed why Arizona doesn't have to follow that trend. You treat everyone like neighbors. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming this evening. It is much appreciated.